So, today we're going to talk about the Chicago Manual of Style, and for all three of you, it's especially important because you're using it in your dissertations. And Chicago style is going to be both your key to success and also perhaps a little bit of your headache. Yeah, exactly. Sometimes trying to figure out how to craft, and really kind of crafting your footnotes and your citations, trying to figure out what's the best use of Chicago in this instance. Because Chicago is, well, let's look at the length of it for a second. I've always, ever since, Brian Fraley showed us Chicago style, he would bring it into the classroom and show us, essentially this is our Bible. And for you guys, everything you need to know is in Chicago, but also a lot of it is up to interpretation, which makes Chicago both good and bad. Because I feel like in many ways Chicago is not as strict as, say, ABA style for certain things. But that strictness in interpretation, especially when we're doing all sorts of types of different type of content, especially content as we're going to talk about church documents, Catholic Church documents, Vatican II documents, that kind of stuff is in kind of a limbo, ambiguous land with Chicago. But I'm going to give you some tips about how to do that with certain sources, some of the basics with Chicago, and hopefully we'll come out of using Chicago with a better handle of how to use it in your dissertation more appropriately. Now, I like this picture with the candles in front of Chicago because I think it gives a bit of a sacred quality to using Chicago. You really develop a relationship with this text for sure. I can tell you, as I'm going through my dissertation, I keep flipping back and forth trying to finding what it is I'm trying to cite in the best way possible. So Chicago basics. Okay. A lot of this is pretty standard across other types of citation styles, but keep in mind that, again, standard size paper, 8.5 by 11. Now, all margins are 1 inch. Now, when you're doing your dissertation, make sure you follow the Dissertation Manual, which states that on that left-hand side, it's going to be, I think, 1.5 inches because of binding issues. So, just keep that in mind. This is for regular papers, but with your dissertations, keep in mind that you need to format it so it's 1.5. Now, if you have charts, if you have graphs and tables, illustrations, make sure that when you format it, that left-hand side by 1.5 inches, that everything stays on the page and that everything comes out the way you want it. Because what's happened in the past is that people type 1 inch, and then that last step, when they format it for submitting to ProQuest, everything gets kind of wonky. So, I had no for my own dissertation. I had no essentially charts or tables or illustrations. So I felt comfortable typing 1 inch and then formatting that later, but keep that in mind as well, depending on your content. Everything should be typed in double space, including block quotes. Now, for the Dissertation Manual for your dissertations, footnotes, you can keep those single spaced. Now, there's one difference between Chicago and the Dissertation Manual, and I'm talking about both because you guys are doing your dissertations. Chicago, with the block quotes, I think it's single space, but with the Dissertation Manual, everything is double spaced. So if you do a block quote, make sure it's double spaced. So everything, table of contents, those sorts of things, make sure that everything remains, even abstract, all those documents, double spaced. Titles are typed in italics, which that's standard. There should be no binding of paper except for staple in the left-hand corner. It's for different types of papers.
Sorry,
yes.
Paper, the title of the paper, or titles used within the paper?
Titles such as New York Times, or different types of books, or all materials should be in italics that are publications. So books, magazines, journals, newspapers, those sorts of things.
Movies?
Put those in italics. Yes.
Movies?
Movies as well. Yeah. So any sort of published work, whether it's digital or print, will be in italics. And with that, with italics, everything is, major words are capitalized. The first letter is capitalized. So I know in APA, I think sometimes just the first word, the first letter of the first word is capitalized, and the rest is undercase. Everything is uppercase. So, when referring to grammar, looking at nouns can be cautiously turned into verbs. As I'm going through, in parentheses, you'll see numbers. This refers to sections in Chicago style. When you look through Chicago style, rather than citing the page number, which would be, I think, is more difficult, find it by section and by number. And if you can figure out that system by the section and the number, it makes reading Chicago style a lot easier. So, if you look in section 5 of Chicago, you'll see a lot of rules about grammar, voice tense, those sorts of things. So look through chapter 5. Nouns can be cautiously turned into verbs. Ending a sentence, a writer may end a sentence with preposition. Just, again, you can end a sentence with a preposition, just don't overdo it. Always keep in mind that you're trying to write an academic work, and if you feel, just don't. Everything with Chicago is, yes, you can, but don't overdo it at a certain point. Writers should use the active voice whenever possible, and I can't stress this enough that using the active voice is a much more preferable, not only just academic writing, but for the Dissertation Manual, using active voice is the standard. Meaning that, an example of this, an active voice, the cat caught the mouse. Passive voice, the mouse is caught by the cat. That passive voice is just more of a mouthful, it's more roundabout. With active voice, go ahead and state it. It's a skill. I'm not talking about theological writing right now, but for writers in theology, it's a difficult skill to learn, writing in active. It can be. We tend to like to use turns of phrases and clever catchphrases and things like that. We use theological jargon sometimes, but try to keep an active voice whenever possible. Avoid the overuse of adverbs. Example, redundancy means that words are superfluous. And then what would be overdoing it? Redundancy means the superfluity of the linguistic feature due to its predictability within the overall structure. It's a mouthful. So think about how you're writing. Think about when you're using Chicago style. Chicago style is not just citations, it's also a style of writing. So keep it direct, keep it to the point, and don't overdo stuff such as adverbs. And try to avoid the passive voice whenever possible. Present tense versus past tense. So, Chicago, especially the Dissertation Manual, prefers present tense. Chicago prefers present tense. When you're writing in your dissertations, we prefer present tense. At least I do, so when I'm format checking. So, example of this, present tense when writing about research and literature. So, for example, Paul writes, Peter explains, Susan describes. So when you're talking about things in your works, so if I'm referring to a philosopher or a theologian, a historian, someone that says something about something, use the present tense. Present tense is used to refer to timeless facts, memorable persons, and works of the past that are still enduring. The use of a conjunction, beginning a sentence with a conjunction, yes you can, don't overdo it again. So stuff like however, so there's widespread, this is from Chicago style, they write, there's widespread belief that one with no historical or grammatical foundation referring to beginning with a conjunction. That is an error. That is an error to begin a sentence with a conjunction. This includes, quote, however. However, well, I'm saying however, don't overdo it. When you're using words such as however, it's more effective within a sentence rather than starting a sentence with however. Other things that are actually pretty much standard, especially with dissertations, language should be bias-free. You can look in Chicago, they have different methods for you to achieve neutral language, gender-neutral language. Try to avoid the singular they. It's becoming more common in writing, but for Chicago style, for the Dissertation Manual, try not to use they in the singular. Don't use slashes. So if you're referring to he or she, don't use a slash like she/he or he/she. Write it out, he or she. So, and you can also see other grammatical rules in 95.6 and 5.227. Spaces, leave only one space after a period or a colon. Now, here's something that...
The period to the right of the last quotation make more sense in that case? Because I'm finishing my sentence as a writer, but not assigning the period to your quote?
No, if the sentence ends, I'm not putting
Ever.
Here, ever.
Okay.
But ever just, because then sometimes I'd be putting the period outside, sometimes I'd be putting the period inside. Always on the inside. If there's more to the quote, when I put my footnote, I can say the complete quote reads. Never put, say, an ellipsis, a dot, 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 at the end of the quote. Ellipsis sometimes indicates that there's more to the quote that was left out. Chicago style, just put a period. Rules for block quotations. So, if you have a quote that is more than 100 words, something, I think, I'm trying to remember if the 100 words is a set standard or not. Something, if you have a quote more than 100 words, then it's recommended that you set that off as a block quote. Meaning that you start a new line, so as you're writing, you stop, you can use a comma, you can use a semicolon, but if you stop, go to the next line, you indent it by you do the tab indent. The surrounding text is indented. You do not use quotation marks in your block quote. Typically, you give an extra space before and after each block quote. Whether you lowercase that first letter of your block quote depends again on your context. So exactly the same rules as you would do for other types of quotation mark, for other types of quotes. Follow the same rules as whether it's capitalized. Ellipsis. So if you're writing, if you have a quote, you're not going to be using all of the quote, but just a portion of it. You can use ellipsis, but again, Chicago says don't use the ellipsis to skew a meaning, to leave out something that would change the meaning of the text. So not needed before the first word of the quote, so don't ever start a quote with ellipsis. Don't put an ellipsis at the end of a quote. Only within the quote itself or material has been left out. So if you have a really long quote, you only need a certain portion of it, you can use ellipsis. Okay. Moving on from grammar and quotations and all those sorts of things to sort of the meat and potatoes of Chicago style. So, Chicago style has two different citation methods. I'm going to focus primarily on notes and bibliography rather than author date, because what you do in author date, so if you know the format, everything is translatable. So if you're doing author date, you can translate, a lot of these rules will translate into that sort of citation style. I'll cover it towards the end, but we're going to focus mainly on notes and bibliography, because I think that's what most of you are going to be doing and working with anyway. Now, what do I mean by notes and bibliography? Exactly what so notes, footnotes. The primary difference between notes and bibliography and author date is an in-text citation style using parentheses. So it's much more similar looking to, say, APA or even MLA. But we're going to focus just on notes and bibliography for right now. So, when you're writing a footnote, the things you want to keep in mind, the most primary relevant information that you need to find or cite is the author's name, the title of the work, the location, the publisher, and the page. So the city was published in, the city's the publisher's location, and then finally the page. For additional citations, so you're going to start with a full, we're going to go through some examples, but you're going to start, every time you cite a work for the first time, use the long version of the citation. So everything, all the full title, don't abbreviate, and then all the publisher information, the year, include that in your first footnote. For additional citations, you can do one or two methods. For additional consecutive citations, you can use what is called IBID, which means in the same place, and then the page number. So IBID, period, quote, IBID, period, comma, and then page number. Now, for those that are doing dissertation, that's fine for a paper. That's fine for a 10-page research paper. For those doing a dissertation, using IBID I wouldn't recommend, because it causes confusion as you're editing and as you're going back and you're moving stuff around. When you move something with IBID, then you have to figure out what is this work, you know. So what I would recommend doing, and Chicago allows you to do this, use a shortened form instead of IBID. So I think I gave the example. So right here, I'll go back. So this is the long version. So Catherine Bell, Ritual Perspectives and Dimensions. So I give all the publication information. Now when I cite Bell again, rather than using IBID, I use what's called the shortened form, which is just the author's last name, a shortened version of the title, and then the page number. And so that way, when you're going back and editing and you're moving stuff around, you don't have to figure out what work this is. Where is this quote from? Versus, how did I get this information? Now, Microsoft Word does a lot of this for you. So when you're using the footnote option, when you insert a footnote, it does this for you. It creates a footnote at the bottom of the page. And for the most part, it does this very well. When I first started doing footnoting several years ago, footnotes were a pain in the butt. And they still can be, but footnotes are much easier now, and much of this is automated in Word. So as long as you set up the right numbering system, so as you insert a footnote, keep it consistent. So in your dissertation, rather than starting a whole new set of numbered footnotes, everything you keep following all the footnotes. So if you start at 1, don't ever start another footnote number 1 again. You're done with footnote number 1. So that way it creates less confusion when you're going back and trying to figure out what's like. For a really good footnote overview, refer to Chicago section 14, number 38. It gives you pretty much all the basics that you need to know about the footnoting. There's a couple things I want you to keep in mind though. Footnote gives you the liberty to kind of explain some things in the text, in the footnote that might not necessarily be in the text, or add quotes or do things within footnotes that you don't find within the text itself. But don't overdo it. Avoiding long footnotes is something that Chicago style recommends. So if you have a footnote and you have to do a paragraph break within your footnote, Chicago style tells you that, yeah, your footnote is probably too long. And also for dissertation manuals, for the dissertation and dissertation manual, I would also recommend trying to avoid, whenever possible, footnotes that are page long, those sorts of things. Because Chicago style tells you that the reader, it always keeps the reader in mind, and that creates a more difficult work for manuscripts, for reading, those sorts of things. You can include several citations in one note, but with everything with your footnoting, everything that you footnote has to correspond to the bibliography at the end of the paper. Every single thing, every single item. So, with the exception of some things, which we'll talk about, but pretty much, yes, there's always exceptions for some things, but pretty much everything you cite in a footnote will correspond to bibliography. Especially that's important for dissertation writing, and when dissertation checking, I will check your citations to see does what you place and what I find in your footnoting correspond to bibliography and vice versa. So you can't also, bibliography is not a place to put works that you didn't cite. So everything, there's a one-to-one correspondence. Really? Yeah. So if
for bibliographies.
Right. So at least for the dissertation manual, and for if you cite something in your bibliography and you never refer to it in your text, I have to find a very good reason for being able to justify it. And that's my understanding of it. So
I think that's the rule for references.
Yes.
Definitely the rule for references, but I'm not too sure about the rule for bibliography. So.
My rule is if you cite it in your bibliography and it's never cited in the text, then I would have to ask why is it there. But moving on, with a footnote, you need to include the author, title, and facts of publication. When you're footnoting, indent by 0.5, right, tab indent, avoiding long footnotes. Whenever possible, as you're footnoting, you may go across two pages. Chicago style just recommends that never go across 2 pages and say, well, for manuscripts is okay. If you're doing for anything else, you may want to pick your break carefully. In certain instances, if you need to see or refer to a work, you can use C in front of your footnote. So you would have your footnote and then C and then the name of the work. We're telling the author, for more information, you can see so-and-so text. So, citing books in the footnote system. Now in the footnote, you include the first name, then the last name, comma, and then the title of the work in italics, each major word capitalized, publication information, so New York, publisher, Oxford, the year is published, comma, the page that you found your information. If you have another page that you would like to cite, you can use a semicolon and then add that page number. When you're citing, when you're citing the city of the publication city, so New York, I don't need to say that this is in New York State because it's a well-known location. If I'm citing a place such as in my dissertation, I cited a place called from Aden, North Carolina. Not many people know where the town of Aden is, so I have to put Aden, comma, NC, letting the reader know that this is where the city is located. But for things such as New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, there's no need to include the city and state. So, my footnote method is very similar to my bibliography method. So, I take the last name this time, I flip it, last name, comma, Catherine, period. The biggest difference between the footnote and the bibliography reference is the use of periods instead of commas. Also, the indentation is changed. So, I indent 0.5 at the top. Here I have a hanging indent. The title is the same. I still have all the same info, but everything is broken up by periods, with the exception of after the publisher, comma, 1997, and then period. And then, of course, the shortened form.
The brackets.
Yes, so, and also, yes, the brackets. For the publication info, the brackets. So New York, Oxford, 1997, set off in brackets.
Quick question.
Yes.
References or bibliography. Dr. Freely made reference of that. He made it sound like there were two. Are they two different things, or are they interchangeable, or what's the business there?
And maybe I'm confused as the question.
Can you have references and bibliography, or is references and bibliography the same thing?
You have a bibliography page.
Right.
And all those references in your bibliography page are what you find in your footnoting in the text itself.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Most of it doesn't.
Okay.
But it's all right.
Excuse me. I don't. If I say references or bibliography, footnotes or endnotes, I think they're also references.
Yes, so I'm referring to a reference here. So this is what you include. So your footnote and your bibliography. So I'm referring to, when I'm using the word reference, I'm referring to your footnotes. When I'm using the word bibliography, I'm referring to your references within your bibliography. Does that make sense?
Has anybody ever suggested to them that it's very confusing when you're having parentheses in one, commas in the other, periods in the other way, when they could just be exactly the same and it makes almost zero difference?
I don't know. They didn't consult me when doing this type of.
Seriously, what do you expect?
I expect some kind of,
No,
if it's a manual of style, that
I
it
know.
itself adheres to it, to some singular style.
Exactly.
Candace.
Okay, so 2 questions. On the footnote, it's supposed to be a superscript, right? The number 1?
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure. And then, maybe to clear up some of what Carlos is saying, or asking. So let's say you used, in one of the footnote, the Catherine Bell footnote, that was the thing, but you also said see somebody else, Powers. You would
Right.
include Powers and Catherine Bell in the bibliography, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So then there is no reference listing at the end of the paper.
No, and that's my fault. I'm using the term reference, meaning bibliography page.
Okay.
It says bibliography at the top, yes.
Carlos, I don't know if you'll find this helpful or not, but the Chicago Manual of Style was first developed years before there were the turn to using references, that is to say, parenthetical and references, parentheses and references. Now, think of it in this sense, that historically you would add a sentence, a very telescopic sentence, at the bottom of the page that would be just like a sentence, except it wouldn't, which means you would have only one period. See the footnote? There's only one period, just like a sentence, just one period. And that extra stuff you don't really need to put in like a real sentence, you put in parentheses. But you start with the first name, because if you were going to do it as an actual sentence, you would give the first name and then the last name. But when you put it in the bibliography, it's very different. And that's because the bibliography is a list of all the books that you utilized, or even those books, and here I'm just going to continue to say what I said before, even those books that you didn't use in your actual text, because you don't need a bibliography to find those books. In your footnote, it tells you everything you need to know to look it up, right? So the bibliography is a separate document that you would put at the end of the book to say, hello, I have now researched everything to be researched on this topic. I'm going to give to the world a cool bibliography. Now that bibliography, of course, is by author last name, because that's going to help you find those books very easily in the old-fashioned library. So think old-fashioned for that. When you go to the newer style, APA, or the newer style, parenthetical, just called because of parentheses, then you have to have references, but get this, references are then what's at the end for the list of the works, because they're a code to figure out author, last name, and date. And so it's really a code, and you go to that end. And if you wanted to use the word references in the footnotes and bibliography, you would say the reference is there, actually, the footnotes. Now, you don't want to say that because that confuses things. But the idea is that the references refer, all of them, nothing else additional. The references refer to what you have in parentheses. And they can only be what's in parentheses, nothing else. They're not a bibliography. But in the old style, which is footnotes bibliography, they would really be two separate documents. Does that help?
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, makes sense like
So
that.
you can see the logic.
Right.
It
right.
might not make the most sense, but you see the logic.
I know how they arrived.
That's exactly it, yes. And it helps remember it too, doesn't it? The parentheses and so on, you know, for the publisher.
I just, for myself, I know how to, there's one form for the footnote and one for the bibliography. I don't ask questions about why it's done that way or how it's done that way. It's just done that way. Because I've never asked a question, I've never even thought of it, why is it in parentheses?
I am built of why.
Yes.
To me, that's just how it's done. I don't know.
It's really
You
fun
know,
to have
so-
classes with you because of that.
We actually everything.
Yeah, me too, with your class.
Other types of things you'll encounter, chapter and edited book. So everything follows the same formula. And if it's the title if it's a chapter in a book, so Paul Ricoeur, comma, the name of the chapter that you're referring to in quotes, quotation, comma, quote, commas within the quotation marks. Then you're telling me that it's in Paul Ricoeur, the name of the work itself, Paul Ricoeur, Hermeneutics and Human Sciences, comma, if I have an editor, which if it's an edited work, it's going to have an editor, ed dot, and then the editor, John B. Thompson, and then, like normal, the publication info. So again, Cambridge University Press, 1981, and then at the end, page numbers, the words that you're from the information that you're citing. So the only difference is that you add this little bit of the chapter title and the editor's name. And then the bibliography. In the bibliography you would put Ricoeur, Paul, last name, first name. Everything else is pretty much the same, with the exception. So periods, period after the title. Instead of the ed dot, the abbreviated, now it's capital, edited by John B. Thompson, period, and then like normal publication info set off by periods, commas, rather than parentheses.
Yes. In the first example, after the city of publication, good. You wrote Oxford,
Yes.
no praise. In the second one, it came out complete.
Okay, and that was, again, my mistake. The rule is, at least the rule that I follow, if you're referring to a university press, I would write out, so Cambridge University Press. So instead of, say, Cambridge, Cambridge. But if I'm doing, say, Baker Academic, if that's my work, then I don't need to say Baker Academic Press. I could just say Baker Academic. I only use the word press typically when it's a university press to distinguish it between, so say right here, Cambridge University. Translator, again, these are pretty much the same rules. So editor, translator pretty much follow the same rules. So I have my author, the title of the work, comma, I abbreviate the word translator, so TRANS, period, the name of my translator and the publication and the publisher info. Then in my bibliography, I use the whole word translated by, and then my translator, and then the info is normal. And then edited volume, same rule. I abbreviate editor, but in the bibliography, I spell out editor. Edited by. Classic works, since you will often encounter using classic works. So Aristotle, I bring up classic works because some people don't know whether to refer to the editor. Is the editor the primary author? Is the philosopher or the ancient writer the primary author? Look at your text. For this work, Aristotle, even though this is a all-in-one volume of, say, Aristotle's works, so the complete works of Aristotle, Aristotle is still the author. Tells me, again, the title, who it's edited by. If I have multiple volumes of a work, I need to state in here 2 volumes. So abbreviate that. If it's part of a series, I refer to the series as well, but before the publisher info, so outside the parentheses or outside the period here. And then the publisher info like normal, and then there's the abbreviated version. And you can also see here for Augustine the same rule.
Jonathan, you're missing
Yes.
the period, is that right? After in the second one and the last one at the very end?
19, yes, there's supposed to be a period there.
Okay. And just to be clear, Jonathan, I'm asking you because I so trust you that I would not be surprised if there was a special reason that I did not fully understand. So I appreciate that.
No, it was just my error. Secondary sources, this sometimes happens, but interesting that Chicago actually discourages you from using secondary sources whenever possible. So, quoting something within another author. So if an author refers to another author and you're quoting that second author, Chicago recommends, especially if you're doing dissertation, to find the original work that quote was in, rather than citing it as a secondary source. So, but if that happens, so you can see you have the original work, Jane Trost, quote, what holds marriage together, continuity change. But after your regular footnote, your citation, you put quoted in, and then the work that you found that quote in. So always remember to put quoted in. Chicago is unclear to us if both must be in the bibliography. I recommend doing it anyway. Put both sources in your bibliography.
Question.
Yes.
If that happen, if we're doing that, for example, and we're gonna do the footnote, how we do it?
If you're quoting, so a secondary source like that, just like this.
The same way?
Excuse me, in the bibliography?
No, in the footnote.
That is
Oh.
a footnote.
Oh, there's a footnote. Oh,
Yeah.
but it says
Bibliography
reference.
is first, is last
It's
name
separate.
first.
Oh, okay.
And if it's the bibliography, then you would follow the same format you do. Remove everything in parentheses,
Yes,
you know.
and no commas good. Okay.
Yeah.
But as separate sources, right? So these two become separate sources.
Yeah, they actually become separate sources. It happens a lot, especially if you're doing a dissertation or a longer work, a quote within a quote. So what you would do is, like you were doing in the body of the text, introducing. So Hanti describes the human body as having, and then your quote. At the end of your quote, period, quote, and then the publication that you got that from. Now, if I had already cited this before, I can just put the shortened form. It's my first time referring to this work. Then, like normal, I need to include the entire publication info and everything. A note within a footnote. Again, if you need to explain something that's not necessarily you have room for in the text itself, you need to there's something from the author that you want to dig a little bit deeper in, you can include a note using the footnote. But at the end of your note, if this is not your information, if you're drawing from a particular author, you still need to cite the author at the end of your own note. If it's just your own words and thoughts, your own commentary, then no, that's not necessary. But if you're referring to a specific author and their work and their works, then you need to cite that author at the end of your own note.
I hope you don't mind the last page,
What's that?
the previous page. Here, the broad view. His broad view is listed.
Broadview Press. Is a university? No. I got this from some other source. I don't remember where. I'm not familiar with Broadview, but typically you would not put the word press there. Yeah, probably should have looked through something. Okay. God, you guys catch everything. Every period, everything. Okay. Journal articles. So, the format again is similar to books, except for some additional information. Author's name, the title of the work, the journal article in quotation marks. In italics will be the name of the work, of the journal. Then after the journal, the volume number, just the number, you don't have to put FVOL or volume, comma, and then the issue number, if there is an issue number. So here, number 2, after the volume and issue number information, in parentheses, the year, the date, or the year, whatever it says on the journal. So this was April 1982, and then colon, the page numbers. Now, if this was an article I found online, you would put comma, and then either the DOI or the URL, the HTTP, whichever one is the most stable. And then in the bibliography, again, using periods instead of commas primarily. Let's see. You still keep the publication date of the issue, April 1982 in parentheses, period, and then the links as the same in the footnote. Yes.
What if the URL is actually JSTOR or ProQuest? Is that still necessary?
I think I thought I cited something. Oh.
There was something about e-journals.
Yes, you still need to include, from what I understand, and I have to go back and look, you still have to include, all those will have a stable URL that you can use, either a DOI or, I know ProQuest and EBSCO both have stable URLs that you can use in the citation.
The notes.
And if no stable URL, this is what I was trying to look for. If you can't find a URL, then provide the name of the database that you found it instead. So if JSTOR for some reason does not have a URL, stable URL that you can use, then use the name of the database instead. But you don't need both. You don't need ProQuest and then the link.
The numbering of the footnote for journal article, it doesn't go with indentation.
What's that?
The numbering of the footnote for a journal article, does it go with the indentation? Like you wrote 1, Theodore W. Jennings.
That's the footnote number.
Yeah, the 1 wasn't indented, but I noticed in the books.
It's indented. If I didn't indent it, it's my own.
Okay, it should be indented.
It should be indented, yeah. Everything with the footnote is indented.
Indented.
0.5. So if I don't do it, it should be. Websites and online magazines, things get a bit more ambiguous with some of these because a lot of websites don't have authors or the title may not be clear. But if you can find, especially with online magazines, if you can usually find author information. So, but author in quotation marks, the title of the article, the name of the publication in italics, and then the date, and then the link that you find. Moving along, encyclopedias. Again, the rule is, again, the article or the entry or whatever it is, in quotation marks, the name of the work is in italics. But again, a lot of this is pretty much, if you know the book, if you know how to footnote with books, that form pretty much translates to everything else. Encyclopedias and dictionaries online. So format similar to this. So Webster, Merriam-Webster online. Well-known reference books, major dictionaries, encyclopedias. This is the exception. You do not need, it's not necessary to include them in the bibliography because they are well-known. Use of scripture. See Chicago style 10.48, 10.49, 10.50 for proper abbreviations for scripture. But for example, if you were going to cite scripture, so 1 Corinthians 6, chapter 6, verses 1 through 10, you would cite that, and then you would put the name of the translation in parentheses, so NRSV, KJV, New Jerusalem, whatever, in parentheses. And that's important. That's very important to include. So we've talked a little bit about e-journals and websites and journals already. Media, certain types of media, if you do cite a DVD, a CD, or some sort of content like that, there are special rules, which again, all this stuff continues the same form we find with everything else. The exception being that you'll be including, so if it's from like a TV show or something, you would include the season or episode number, who was directed by, you would have an air date, and then the publication information would be, say, the studio, and then what type of content this is. So I said this was a DVD. Or, say, a compact disc, or Blu-ray, or whatever. Okay, church documents. Okay, I want to make sure I cover this because I had a problem one time with church documents with one dissertation. Okay. Rather than, so you have a choice here. You can cite the work as a whole. So Vatican, so we're using example of the Vatican Council II. You can cite the work as a whole with the editor, or you can cite each individual church document from Vatican II. What I would recommend for the sake of clarity is to cite each individual, so Vatican II has lots of different documents within it that, within it. So, rather than citing the work as a whole, you cite each individual church document. And then which volume, which book did you get this out of, with the editor info, with the publication info, rather than citing Flannery as the editor, which makes it confusing. Cite using, say, the Catholic Church, and then the name of the church document, and then where did you find this particular church document, what text was that? So, in bibliography, all sources cited in the text, single alphabetical list, all sources must be included. Don't break it up. You don't break it up by themes or by chapters. One single list, all alphabetical. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm moving on quickly. So, author date references. So now we have the notes and bibliography system. The author date system is slightly different because it uses the parenthetical citations within the text itself. So, within the text, it's confusing because there's two different types of citation methods within Chicago, but do not do both. Never do notes and bibliography and author date together in any way, shape, or form. You don't ever do it together. So if you're using footnotes, stay with footnotes, and if you're using the author date system, stay with it, go with it. Just make your choice. Typically in humanities, theology, you're going to be using notes and bibliography. If you're doing anything social science related, with quantifiable information, then you might be using author date. But an example of this is that you include the author's within the parentheses itself, you include the author's surname, year of publication, and page number. And that's it. But the reference list, so now we're talking about, again, the confusion between reference and bibliography. Now we're talking about a reference list at the end of the paper that lists everything cited. So, say, so if I refer to Oswald, 1991, page 12 within my text, then I would include, in my reference list, I include last name, Oswald, Roy, M. Then the year goes after the author. So 1991, period. Then the name of the title, and then the publication info. So it's the same information. It's kind of shuffled around a little bit, but the notes and bibliography system can be translated into a lot of the author date style as well. So if you know how to cite something in notes and bibliography, all it does is require a little bit of shifting around to get it into the correct author date form in the references. So a couple examples. So a chapter in edited work. So if I was citing Bill Bolton, 2002, page 165, I would cite the work, the title of the chapter, and then I would put in italics the book, comma, edited by, who was the editor, page number, and then publisher information. A couple of things to keep in mind. When listing the editor rather than the author in the references, abbreviations such as ED, EDS, or TR or trans are omitted in the in-text citation. Organizations can be abbreviated in the in-text citation. And if you're using a reprint of a classic work, you can put in brackets next to the date, in front of the date of the original work, if you need to make that clear. And this is what I was talking about earlier. This is why we're not going to spend too much time on author date, because Chicago Manual style states that the majority of examples in chapter 14, which is where you find notes in bibliography, can be adapted to the author date system with relative ease. So it's just a matter of retranslating that, putting that into the proper form to match the author date format. So for example, church document is the same church document I cited earlier. You would cite, again, Catholic Church, comma, the, period, year, and then the name of the work, and then pages 52 to 56, and then the editor, and then title, and then publication information. Okay, wrap up really quick. A couple of things for the dissertation manual. Chicago has its own style for headings. Do not use that style. So, I know it's confusing, but if you're writing a dissertation and you're submitting that dissertation to the library, we require everybody, for the sake of consistency, to follow the heading style of APA. So, on the dissertation manual, you'll find this information. So just as you're writing and you're creating your headings, just follow the APA style for headings. That's just the way we do it for the sake of everybody having some sort of consistency when we're trying to check what level heading is this. So keep that in mind, that you're not using the Chicago heading style. Dissertation manual, table of contents. Look through the dissertation manual. Follow this exactly as it appears. So you need all of this, well, if not using illustrations, of course, or charts and graphs, omit that, but you need title page, copyright acknowledgement page, and library release page, abstract. You don't need to use acknowledgements, that's only if necessary, if you want to, or dedication. But go through the dissertation manual and make sure that when you do submit your dissertation or ProQuest, that the information that we need here is there. So follow the table of contents exactly, with the exception of things that you're not including, such as charts or graphs if you don't have any charts or graphs. And then finally, charts, graphs, illustrations for those, again, submitting a dissertation. Make sure that they fit within the margins. Make sure they can be in color, but make sure that they can be reproducible in, say, grayscale. And then the labeling of those charts must conform to the style guide of, so say, Chicago. Keep in mind that when you're citing a chart or a graph, you have to get permission. If you're using that chart or graph or table from another source, another author, you have to get permission to reprint that. So, and that holds people up sometimes. So there are methods and ways of gaining permission to using certain charts and graphs from other types of sources. You have to have permission from the publisher or author to get to be able to use that information. But that's only if, usually that's not the case with PhD dissertations, but just in case. Again, margins 1.5 on the left-hand side for dissertations. And follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And that's it.